Spring 1945. Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. 3 American ordnance engineers stood in a secure testing facility, their hands running over a weapon that would fundamentally challenge everything they thought they knew about infantry firearms. The rifle before them was unlike anything in the Allied arsenal. It wasn't a traditional battle rifle like the M1 Garand that had served American forces so well throughout the war. It wasn't a submachine gun like the Thompson or the M3 grease gun. It was something entirely new, something that occupied a space between these two categories that American military doctrine hadn't even recognized existed. The weapon was German, captured from Wehrmacht soldiers during the final desperate battles in Western Europe. Its designation was Sturmgewehr 44, and it represented a revolution in small arms design that would reshape infantry combat for the next 8 decades and beyond. The engineers who examined this captured weapon that spring day were confronted with a design philosophy so fundamentally different from American and Allied thinking that it took them considerable time to fully comprehend what they were looking at and why it worked so effectively. This is the story of how German engineers, driven by the brutal realities of the Eastern Front and constrained by wartime material shortages, created the world's first true assault rifle, and how that innovation would influence every military force on Earth for generations to come. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The journey toward the Sturmgewehr 44 began not in a design bureau or an engineering laboratory, but in the frozen hell of the Eastern Front, where German soldiers were learning harsh lessons about infantry combat that would force a complete rethinking of small arms doctrine. When Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, invading the Soviet Union with more than 3 million troops in the largest military operation in human history, German infantry were equipped with weapons that reflected military thinking from the First World War and the interwar period. The standard German infantry rifle was the Karabiner 98 Kurz, universally known as the Kar 98K, or simply K98K. This was a bolt-action rifle firing the 7.92 by 57mm Mauser cartridge, a powerful full-power rifle round that had been developed in 1888 and refined over subsequent decades. The K98K was an excellent weapon by the standards of bolt-action military rifles. It was accurate, reliable, well-manufactured, and capable of effective fire out to ranges exceeding 600 meters in the hands of a trained marksman. German military doctrine, inherited from the First World War and refined during the interwar years, emphasized the importance of long-range rifle fire. German training programs taught soldiers to engage targets at ranges of 300 to 600 meters. The powerful 7.92 Mauser cartridge was specifically designed to be effective at these extended ranges. German military theorists believed that infantry combat would often occur at these longer distances, and they designed their weapons and trained their soldiers accordingly. This emphasis on long-range firepower made perfect sense given the experience of the First World War, where opposing forces had often engaged each other across distances of several hundred meters in relatively static trench warfare. It made sense given the open terrain of places like Poland and France, where German forces had achieved stunning victories in 1939 and 1940. But the Eastern Front proved to be a completely different kind of war, and the assumptions that had worked in Poland and France proved dangerously inadequate in the vast expanses of Russia and in the brutal close-quarters combat that characterized much of the fighting there. The sheer scale of the Eastern Front was unlike anything German forces had previously encountered. The front lines eventually stretched more than 1,600 kilometers from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. The distances involved were staggering. Supply lines stretched for hundreds of kilometers. Units operated across frontages that would have encompassed entire campaigns in Western Europe. The terrain varied from dense forests to open steppes to urban environments to frozen tundra, and the weather conditions ranged from the brutal cold of Russian winters, where temperatures could drop to -40 degrees or colder, to the spring mud season when roads became impassable rivers of mud, to the dust and heat of summer. In this vast and varied landscape, German infantry found themselves fighting a different kind of war than they had trained for, and a different kind of war than their weapons had been designed for. Analysis of actual combat engagements on the Eastern Front revealed something that contradicted decades of military doctrine and training. The vast majority of infantry combat was not occurring at the 3 to 100 to 6 to 100 meter ranges that German doctrine emphasized, and that the K-98K had been designed for. Instead, most infantry engagements were happening at ranges of 300 meters or less, and very often at ranges under 200 meters or even under 100 meters. In forested terrain, which covered vast portions of the Eastern Front, visibility was often limited to a few dozen meters. In urban combat, which became increasingly common as the war progressed, and German forces found themselves fighting in cities like Stalingrad, and later defending German cities against Soviet advances, engagement ranges were often measured in tens of meters rather than hundreds. Even in relatively open terrain, the reality of combat was that soldiers typically engaged enemies at much closer ranges than doctrine suggested. There were several reasons for this disconnect between doctrine and reality. First, hitting a human-sized target at ranges beyond 300 meters with iron sights, even with an accurate rifle, was extremely difficult under ideal conditions, and nearly impossible under the stress and confusion of actual combat. Second, soldiers naturally sought cover and concealment, which meant they often didn't see enemies until relatively close ranges. Third, the nature of offensive operations, which characterized much of the German advance into the Soviet Union in 1941 and 1942, often brought forces into close contact relatively quickly. The problem German infantry faced on the Eastern Front was that their primary weapon, the excellent K-98K bolt-action rifle, was optimized for a kind of combat that wasn't actually happening very often, while being poorly suited for the kind of combat that was happening constantly. A bolt-action rifle, no matter how well designed, has an inherent limitation in rate of fire. An experienced soldier with a K-98K could fire perhaps 15 rounds per minute under ideal conditions, and more realistically 10 to 12 rounds per minute in combat conditions. This was adequate, even superior, for carefully aimed long-range fire. But in close-quarters combat at ranges under 200 meters, particularly when facing multiple enemies or when under pressure from attacking Soviet infantry, the bolt-action rifle's slow rate of fire was a serious handicap. The German solution to this problem, as it existed in 1941, was to equip some soldiers in each infantry squad with submachine guns. The MP-38 and its simplified successor, the MP-40, which American soldiers called the Schmeisser, though it was not actually designed by Hugo Schmeisser, was a 9mm submachine gun that could fire approximately 500 rounds per minute on full automatic. The MP-40 was excellent for close-quarters combat. It provided the high rate of fire needed to suppress enemies, to engage multiple targets quickly, to lay down covering fire during assaults. In urban combat, in forest fighting, in trench raids, the MP-40 was devastatingly effective. Soviet soldiers feared the German submachine guns, and with good reason. But the MP-40 had limitations that were equally serious as the K-98K's limitations, just in different circumstances. The 9mm parabellum cartridge that the MP-40 fired was a pistol cartridge, relatively low-powered and effective only at short ranges. Beyond 100 meters, the MP-40 was nearly useless. The bullet dropped rapidly, accuracy degraded severely, and even if a bullet hit a target at extended range, it might not have enough energy remaining to incapacitate effectively. So, German infantry squads in 1941 and 1942 were equipped with a mix of weapons. Most soldiers carried K-98K rifles, excellent for long-range fire but slow firing. A few soldiers in each squad carried MP-40 submachine guns, excellent for close-range fire but useless beyond 100 meters. This created a situation where the squad had weapons optimized for two different ranges, long-range and very close range, but lacked an effective weapon for the intermediate ranges where most combat was actually occurring. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. At ranges between 100 and 300 meters, which combat analysis showed was where the majority of engagements actually occurred, German infantry were at a disadvantage. The rifles were too slow-firing for the rapid engagement of multiple targets that characterized combat at these ranges. The submachine guns lacked the range and accuracy to be effective. German infantry units were finding themselves in situations where they had the wrong weapon for the tactical situation they faced, and that mismatch was costing lives and degrading combat effectiveness. German ordnance officials and small arms designers began to recognize this problem as reports filtered back from the Eastern Front. Combat experience was revealing a fundamental gap in the German infantry weapons system, a gap that existing weapons could not fill. What was needed was something entirely new, something that didn't exist in any army's arsenal. What was needed was a weapon that combined the range and accuracy of a rifle with the rapid-fire capability of a submachine gun. What was needed was a weapon optimized for combat at the ranges where combat actually occurred, roughly 100 to 300 meters, rather than being optimized for either very long ranges or very close ranges. This need drove the development of an entirely new category of weapon and an entirely new ammunition cartridge to feed it. The breakthrough insight that made the assault rifle possible came from questioning a fundamental assumption that had governed military rifle design for more than half a century. That assumption was that infantry rifles needed to fire full-power rifle cartridges capable of effective fire at ranges of 600 meters or more. The 7.92 by 57 mm Mauser cartridge, the 30-06 Springfield cartridge used by American forces, the 7.62 by 54 mm rimmed cartridge used by Soviet forces, of the 303 British cartridge. All of these were full-power rifle cartridges designed for long-range effectiveness. These cartridges were powerful, which was excellent for long-range shooting, but that power came with significant costs. The recoil from full-power rifle cartridges was substantial, which made rapid fire difficult and made fully automatic fire nearly impossible to control. The ammunition was large and heavy, which meant soldiers could carry fewer rounds. The rifles designed to handle these powerful cartridges had to be robustly built, which made them heavy. The muzzle blast and noise were substantial, and as combat analysis from the Eastern Front was demonstrating, most of this power was simply unnecessary for the ranges at which combat actually occurred. German engineers and ordnance officials began to ask a revolutionary question. What if, instead of designing a weapon around existing full-power rifle cartridges, they designed a completely new cartridge, specifically optimized for the ranges where combat actually occurred? What if they created an intermediate cartridge, something more powerful than a pistol round but less powerful than a full-power rifle round, and then designed a weapon around that cartridge? This intermediate cartridge could be smaller and lighter than full-power rifle ammunition, allowing soldiers to carry more rounds. It would generate less recoil, making rapid fire and even full automatic fire controllable. It would require less robust rifle construction, potentially making the weapon lighter, and because it was designed specifically for effectiveness at ranges up to 300 or 400 meters, rather than 600 meters or more, it could be optimized for the combat that actually occurred, rather than the combat that doctrine imagined might occur. This insight, that the rifle cartridge itself was the fundamental constraint that needed to be changed, was genuinely revolutionary. It challenged half a century of military doctrine and weapons development. It suggested that armies around the world had been optimizing their infantry weapons for the wrong requirements. The development work that would eventually produce the Sturmgewehr 44 began in the late 1930s, several years before the invasion of the Soviet Union, though the program would be dramatically accelerated and redirected by combat experience on the Eastern Front. The German Army Weapons Agency, the Heereswaffenamt, issued specifications in 1938 for a new machine carbine, calling for a weapon that would be lighter and handier than existing rifles, while offering greater firepower. Several German arms manufacturers submitted proposals. The StG, Haenel Company of Suhl, Germany, under the leadership of chief designer Hugo Schmeisser, one of the most accomplished firearms designers of the 20th century, began development work on what would eventually become the assault rifle. Working in parallel, Schmeisser and his team were also developing the revolutionary intermediate cartridge that would make the assault rifle concept practical. This new cartridge, designated 7.92 by 33mm Kurz, which means short in German, represented the careful balance of characteristics needed for an intermediate cartridge. The 7.92 by 33 Kurz cartridge used the same diameter bullet as the standard German 7.92 by 57 Mauser cartridge, which simplified manufacturing since existing bullet production facilities could be used with minimal modification. But the cartridge case was dramatically shorter, only 33mm compared to 57mm for the standard Mauser round. This shorter case held less propellant, which meant lower power, lower recoil, lighter weight, and smaller size. The ballistic performance of the 7.92 Kurz was carefully designed for effectiveness at intermediate ranges. Muzzle velocity was approximately 2,247 feet per second, compared to roughly 2,500 feet per second for the full-power 7.92 Mauser. This was more than adequate for effective fire at ranges up to 300 meters and acceptable accuracy and lethality out to approximately 400 meters. The reduced recoil meant that fully automatic fire was controllable, allowing a soldier to fire rapid bursts and keep the weapon on target. The lighter weight and smaller size meant a soldier could carry significantly more ammunition for the same total weight. While the theoretical concept of an intermediate cartridge was elegant and made perfect sense on paper, actually designing and manufacturing a weapon to use this cartridge and proving that the concept worked in practice was an enormous challenge. Hugo Schmeisser's team at Hanel worked through multiple prototype iterations, solving one engineering problem after another. The weapon had to be selective fire, capable of both semi-automatic fire for careful aimed shots and fully automatic fire for close-range engagements or suppressive fire. The gas-operated action had to be reliable under the harsh conditions of Tixnea, military service, functioning in extreme cold, in mud and dirt, with minimal cleaning and maintenance. The weapon needed to be relatively lightweight and compact, while still being durable enough for combat use. It needed to be manufacturable in quantity, using wartime production methods and with wartime material constraints. By 1942, Hanel had produced working prototypes of what was initially designated the Maschinenkarabiner 1942, or MKB-42, machine carbine 1942. These early prototypes showed enormous promise, and the German army began field testing with combat units on the Eastern Front. The results of these field trials were extraordinary. Soldiers who tested the MKB-42 enthusiastically praised the weapon. It was lighter than the K98K rifle, making it easier to carry during long marches and less fatiguing in combat. The selective fire capability meant a single weapon could fulfill roles that previously required either a rifle or a submachine gun. The intermediate cartridge provided effective range far beyond any submachine gun, while the full automatic capability provided firepower far beyond any bolt-action or semi-automatic rifle. The controllable recoil meant that even fully automatic fire could be kept on target at combat ranges. Soldiers reported that the weapon was particularly effective in the confused close-range fighting that characterized so much of the combat on the Eastern Front. The ability to rapidly engage multiple targets with aimed fire, to deliver suppressive fire when needed, to transition instantly between semi-automatic precision fire and full automatic rapid fire, gave German infantry squads equipped with the weapon a significant tactical advantage. Reports from the Eastern Front indicated that units equipped with the MKB-42 achieved significantly higher combat effectiveness compared to units equipped with standard weapons. The program seemed poised for success, with a revolutionary weapon that clearly met a genuine combat need and that soldiers enthusiastically embraced. But the program faced an obstacle that had nothing to do with technical performance and everything to do with politics, bureaucracy, and Adolf Hitler's personal prejudices about weapons design. Adolf Hitler, who frequently involved himself in weapons development decisions, often with disastrous results, had formed strong opinions about infantry weapons. He believed that infantry rifles should fire full-power rifle cartridges, He believed that reducing the power of the infantry rifle cartridge would reduce the effectiveness of German infantry. He believed that the traditional concept of the bolt-action rifle firing powerful ammunition at long ranges was fundamentally correct. When Hitler learned of the MKB-42 program and the intermediate cartridge it used, he was opposed to further development. He ordered that work on the program be stopped, viewing it as a waste of resources that should be devoted to production of proven weapons rather than experimental designs. This opposition from the very top of the Nazi command structure should have killed the program entirely. In the rigidly hierarchical and often brutal Nazi system, direct orders from Hitler were not questioned or circumvented without serious risk. But the officers and engineers involved in the program believed so strongly in the weapon's value, based on combat testing results and feedback from frontline soldiers, that they made the extraordinarily risky decision to continue development in direct defiance of Hitler's orders. They continued the program in secret, using bureaucratic maneuvering and creative accounting to hide the ongoing development work and production. They redesignated the weapon, changing its designation from Maschinenkarabiner, machine carbine, to Maschinenpistole, machine pistol, even though it was clearly not a pistol. This redesignation was intended to disguise the continued development as work on a submachine gun rather than a rifle, which might face less scrutiny since Hitler had no objection to submachine gun development. The weapon was now officially the MP-43, and limited production began even as the program technically wasn't supposed to exist. The officers and engineers involved in this deception were taking enormous personal risks. In Nazi Germany, defying a direct order from Hitler could result in dismissal, disgrace, imprisonment, or even execution. The fact that they were willing to take these risks demonstrates how strongly they believed in the weapon's importance and how clearly combat results had demonstrated its effectiveness. By early 1944, as Germany's military situation deteriorated on all fronts, with Soviet forces advancing in the east and Allied forces preparing for the invasion of France in the west, the arguments for a more effective infantry weapon became increasingly impossible to ignore. Field. Reports continued to demonstrate the MP-43's superiority over standard infantry weapons. German forces were increasingly on the defensive, fighting outnumbered against enemies who were growing stronger, while German strength was being ground down by years of attrition. Any weapon that could increase the combat effectiveness of German infantry was desperately needed. The officers who had continued the program in defiance of Hitler's orders arranged for him to receive detailed reports on the weapon's performance, carefully framing the information to emphasize combat effectiveness and soldier approval. They arranged for Hitler to see the weapon demonstrated, and finally, in the spring of 1944, Hitler reversed his earlier position. Whether he genuinely came to appreciate the weapon's merits, or whether he simply recognized that Germany's deteriorating military situation required every possible advantage is unclear. But whatever his reasoning, Hitler approved the program and allegedly even suggested the weapon's final designation. The weapon was renamed Sturmgewehr, assault rifle, followed by the year of its introduction, 1944. The Sturmgewehr 44, or StG 44, was the designation that would enter history. The term Sturmgewehr was new, a designation that had never been used before because the category of weapon it described had never existed before. An assault rifle was something fundamentally different from either a rifle or a submachine gun, occupying a middle ground that combined characteristics of both. The StG 44 that entered production in 1944 incorporated refinements and improvements based on extensive combat testing of the earlier MKB-42 and MP-43 variants. The final production, StG 44, was a selective fire rifle chambered in 7.92 by 33mm Kurz. It used a gas-operated tilting bolt action that was reliable and robust. The weapon weighed approximately 11.5 pounds loaded with a full 30-round magazine, compared to approximately 9 pounds for a K98K rifle with a 5-round internal magazine. So the StG 44 was somewhat heavier than the bolt-action rifle it was designed to supplement or replace, but it offered 6 times the magazine capacity and vastly greater firepower. The cyclic rate of fire, was approximately 500 to 600 rounds per minute on full automatic, similar to the MP-40 submachine gun. But unlike the submachine gun, the StG-44 remained effective at ranges beyond 100 meters. Practical effective range was approximately 300 meters, with acceptable accuracy and lethality out to 400 meters. This was far superior to any submachine gun, while the full automatic capability and magazine capacity were far superior to any bolt-action or semi-automatic rifle. The weapon used a detachable box magazine holding 30 rounds. Magazines could be changed quickly, and the higher capacity meant fewer magazine changes compared to the 5 or 8 round capacities typical of bolt-action and semi-automatic rifles of the era. The sights were simple and robust, designed for rapid target acquisition at combat ranges rather than precision shooting at extended ranges. The StG-44 incorporated a stamped steel receiver rather than a machined receiver, which simplified manufacturing and reduced costs. This was partly driven by wartime necessity, as Germany faced increasing raw material shortages and needed manufacturing methods that were faster and required less skilled labor. But the stamped steel construction also proved to be adequately durable for military service. The weapon featured several thoughtful design details that reflected combat experience. The selector switch, which allowed the operator to choose between semi-automatic and full automatic fire, was positioned where it could be easily operated with the thumb of the shooting hand without significantly breaking the firing grip. The safety was similarly well positioned. The charging handle was on the left side of the weapon, which allowed it to be operated without removing the firing hand from the pistol grip or significantly disturbing the sight picture. The detachable magazine system was far superior to the internal magazines of most rifles, allowing for much faster reloading under combat conditions. A soldier with proper training could change magazines on the StG-44 in just a few seconds, whereas reloading a 5-round internal magazine on a K98K with stripper clips took considerably longer and required more manual dexterity. The weapon could mount the standard German bayonet, maintaining compatibility with existing equipment and allowing for close-quarters combat when necessary. It could also mount a variety of sights and accessories, though most were issued with standard iron sights. Production of the StG-44 began in earnest in mid-1944, but by this point in the war, Germany's industrial capacity was severely degraded by years of Allied strategic bombing, material shortages, and the general chaos of a collapsing war economy. The weapon was produced by multiple manufacturers, including Heinel, Mauser, and several others, but total production numbers fell far short of what would have been needed to equip the entire German armed forces. Estimates vary, but most historians believe that between 400,000 and 500,000 StG-44 rifles were produced between mid-1944 and the end of the war in May 1945. This was a substantial number, but it represented only a fraction of German infantry strength. For comparison, millions of K98K rifles had been produced, and the German military had millions of soldiers under arms. The StG-44 would never become the standard infantry weapon for German forces, simply because there wasn't enough time or production capacity remaining to manufacture them in the quantities that would have been required. The weapon was issued primarily to units on the Eastern Front, where the close-range infantry combat that characterized fighting in that theatre made the assault rifle's advantages most apparent and most valuable. Units fighting in urban environments, in forests, and in defensive positions received priority for the new weapon. Some units on the Western Front also received StG-44s, particularly after the Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944, when Germany was fighting desperately on 2 major fronts simultaneously. Elite units, including Waffen-SS divisions and paratroop formations, received preferential allocation of the scarce weapons. Fallschirmjäger, German paratroopers, found the StG-44 particularly well suited to their needs, as it provided the firepower of a submachine gun with significantly greater effective range, which was valuable for lightly armed airborne forces who often fought outnumbered after landing. But the majority of German infantry soldiers would never receive an StG-44 They would continue fighting with K-98K bolt-action rifles and MP-40 submachine guns until the end of the war. The StG-44 arrived too late, and in too limited quantities to significantly alter the outcome of the war. Germany's defeat was by 1944 inevitable, given the overwhelming material and manpower superiority of the Allied coalition. No infantry weapon, no matter how revolutionary, could have changed the fundamental strategic reality that Germany was being ground down by enemies who possessed vastly greater industrial capacity and human resources. But while the StG-44 didn't change the outcome of World War II, it profoundly changed the future of infantry weapons development. The soldiers who did receive the StG-44 recognized immediately that they were holding something genuinely revolutionary. Combat reports from units equipped with the assault rifle were enthusiastic and detailed. Soldiers reported that the weapon dramatically improved their effectiveness in combat. The ability to deliver rapid, accurate fire at intermediate ranges gave them advantages in the kinds of engagements that dominated infantry combat on the Eastern Front. In defensive situations, which characterized most German operations by late 1944 as they fought to slow the advancing Soviet armies, soldiers armed with StG-44s could engage attacking Soviet infantry at ranges where the Soviet submachine guns were ineffective, while delivering far more firepower than bolt-action rifles could provide. A single soldier with an StG-44 and several loaded magazines could deliver the firepower that would have previously required multiple soldiers with bolt-action rifles. In offensive operations, increasingly rare for German forces by late 1944, but still occurring in local counterattacks and attempts to recapture lost positions, the StG-44 provided the sustained firepower needed to suppress enemy positions while advancing. The weapon was particularly effective in urban combat, which became increasingly common as Soviet forces pushed into German-held cities in Poland and eventually into Germany itself. In the close-quarters fighting that characterized urban warfare, where engagement ranges were often measured in tens of meters rather than hundreds, the StG-44 was devastating. It combined the close-range firepower of a submachine gun with effective range that extended well beyond what submachine guns could achieve, allowing soldiers to engage enemies across city streets and open squares with lethal effectiveness. The 30-round magazine capacity meant that soldiers could sustain fire without frequent reloading, which was crucial in the rapid pace of urban combat where stopping to reload could be fatal. German soldiers who had experienced combat both with traditional weapons and with the StG-44 overwhelmingly preferred the assault rifle. They understood from direct, visceral experience that this weapon represented a fundamental advance in infantry combat capability. Some German military writers and historians would later claim that if the StG-44 had been developed earlier and produced in quantity from 1942 or 1943 instead of from mid-1944, it might have significantly altered the course of the war on the Eastern Front by increasing German infantry combat effectiveness at a critical period. This is almost certainly an exaggeration. Germany's defeat was ensured by factors far more fundamental than infantry weapons, including the Soviet Union's vast manpower reserves and industrial capacity, American industrial might, strategic errors by German leadership, and the brutal mathematics of a multi-front war against a powerful coalition. But the fact that such claims were made at all demonstrates how highly German soldiers and officers valued the weapon. Allied forces first encountered the StG-44 in combat in late 1944, and these encounters were initially confusing and concerning. American and British soldiers facing German forces armed with assault rifles found themselves under surprisingly effective rapid fire from ranges where they expected enemy infantry to have only bolt-action rifles. The sound of the weapon was distinctive, different from both the slower, heavier sound of rifle fire and the rapid burping of submachine guns. Intelligence reports began filtering back through Allied command structures, describing a new German weapon, some kind of automatic rifle that seemed to combine characteristics of both rifles and submachine guns. Initial intelligence reports were often confused or incomplete, mixing information about the StG-44 with reports of other German weapons. The fog of war and the chaos of combat made it difficult to compile accurate intelligence about enemy weapons from the fragmentary reports of soldiers who had been on the receiving end of fire from weapons they hadn't clearly seen. But as more reports accumulated, and as Allied forces began capturing examples of the weapon along with German soldiers who could be interrogated about it, the picture became clearer. The Allies were facing something genuinely new, a category of weapon that didn't exist in British or American arsenals. The first intact StG 44s captured by American forces were sent back through intelligence channels for analysis. Some went to field intelligence units for immediate tactical assessment. Others were sent to Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, the primary US Army testing facility for weapons and equipment. At Aberdeen, ordnance engineers and small arms experts examined the captured weapons with intense interest and growing concern. These were men who understood firearms design at the deepest technical level. They could appreciate the engineering sophistication and the thoughtful design decisions that had gone into the StG 44. They could recognize immediately that this weapon represented a fundamentally new approach to infantry armament. The engineers at Aberdeen conducted systematic testing of the captured StG 44s, evaluating their accuracy, reliability, ease of use, and overall combat effectiveness. They test-fired the weapons extensively, measuring muzzle velocity, accuracy at various ranges, dispersion patterns in full automatic fire, and reliability under different conditions. They disassembled the weapons completely, examining every component, studying the gas-operated action, analyzing the manufacturing methods, evaluating the materials and tolerances. They compared the StG 44 directly against American infantry weapons, including the M1 Garand semi-automatic rifle, the M1 carbine, and the Thompson and M3 submachine guns. The results of this analysis were sobering for American ordnance officials. The StG 44 was in many respects superior to any infantry weapon in the American arsenal. It provided capabilities that no American weapon could match. The M1 Garand, which General George Patton had famously called the greatest battle implement ever devised, and which had served American forces superbly throughout the war, was semi-automatic only and fired the powerful .30-06 cartridge. It was accurate and reliable, and its 8-round capacity gave American infantry a significant advantage over enemy forces armed with bolt-action rifles. But it couldn't match the StG 44's firepower or its effectiveness in close to intermediate range combat. The Garand was heavier, carried fewer rounds, and lacked full automatic capability. The M1 carbine, a lighter weapon firing a less powerful cartridge than the Garand, was popular with soldiers, but for its lightweight and handy size. It was effective at close ranges, but lacked the power and range to be truly effective beyond 200 meters. The Thompson submachine gun and the M3 grease gun that supplemented and eventually replaced it were excellent weapons for close-quarters combat, but they fired pistol cartridges and were ineffective beyond 100 meters. Just like the German MP40, they were meant to counter. American infantry, like German infantry before the StG 44, had weapons optimized for either long range or very close range, but lacked an effective weapon for intermediate ranges. The difference was that American forces compensated for this gap with overwhelming firepower superiority at the squad and platoon level through other means. American infantry squads typically had access to far more automatic weapons than their German counterparts, including the Browning automatic rifle, which provided squad-level suppressive fire capability. American forces had artillery support on a scale that German forces could only dream about by late 1944. American infantry could call on air support, armor support, and massive quantities of ammunition that German logistics could no longer provide to their forces. So while American infantry weapons might have been less sophisticated in concept than the StG 44, American infantry were not at an overall disadvantage because their advantages in other areas more than compensated. But the American ordnance engineers analyzing the StG 44 understood that they were looking at the future of infantry weapons. They recognized that the assault rifle concept was fundamentally sound and represented a genuine advance over existing approaches to infantry armament. They understood that this was the direction infantry weapons development would inevitably move in the post-war period. The engineers were particularly impressed by several aspects of the StG-44's design. The intermediate cartridge concept was brilliant in its simplicity and effectiveness. By questioning the fundamental assumption that infantry rifles needed to fire full-power cartridges, German designers had unlocked performance characteristics that were impossible with traditional rifle cartridges. The 7.92 by 33 Kurz cartridge provided exactly the right balance of characteristics for the ranges where infantry combat actually occurred. The selective fire capability was valuable and well implemented. The ability to choose between semi-automatic fire for precision and full automatic fire for suppression or close-range combat gave the individual soldier tactical flexibility that no single-purpose weapon could match. The magazine system was superior to the internal magazines of most military rifles. The 30-round capacity provided sustained fire capability that was particularly valuable in defensive situations or when outnumbered. The gas-operated action was reliable and relatively simple. While the StG-44 was more mechanically complex than a bolt-action rifle, it was not excessively complicated and proved reasonably reliable under field conditions. The manufacturing methods, using stamped metal components rather than entirely machined parts, were a practical response to wartime constraints, but also pointed toward more economical manufacturing approaches that would become standard in post-war weapons production. The engineers noted some shortcomings as well. The weapon was somewhat heavy, though not excessively so for its capabilities. The stamped metal construction, while practical, resulted in a weapon that felt less refined than the carefully machined weapons American and British forces were accustomed to. The sights were adequate but not exceptional. The weapon's accuracy in semi-automatic mode was good but not outstanding, certainly not matching the precision possible with a carefully built bolt-action rifle like the K98K or a well-made semi-automatic like the M1 Garand when fired from stable positions at longer ranges. But these were relatively minor criticisms. The overall assessment was that the StG-44 represented a new and effective approach to infantry weapons that American designers would need to study carefully and learn from. British forces also captured StG-44s and conducted their own evaluations, reaching similar conclusions. British ordnance experts recognized the revolutionary nature of the assault rifle concept and understood its implications for future weapons development. Soviet forces, who had been facing German soldiers armed with StG-44s since the weapon first appeared in significant numbers on the Eastern Front in late 1944, had perhaps the most extensive combat experience against the assault rifle. Soviet intelligence had captured examples of the weapon and its ammunition. Soviet small arms designers had studied the weapon carefully, and their analysis would profoundly influence Soviet weapons development in the immediate post-war period. The impact of the StG-44 on post-war weapons development cannot be overstated. The assault rifle concept that Hugo Schmeisser and his team at Haenel had pioneered became the dominant paradigm for infantry weapons for the remainder of the 20th century and into the 21st. Within a few years of the war's end, multiple nations were developing their own assault rifles based on lessons learned from the StG-44. The Soviet Union moved quickly, developing the AK-47 under the direction of Mikhail Kalashnikov. The AK-47, which entered service in 1949, was chambered in 7.62 by 39 mm, an intermediate cartridge clearly inspired by the German 7.92 Kurz. The AK-47 borrowed conceptual elements from the StG-44, while incorporating its own innovations and reflecting Soviet manufacturing priorities and tactical doctrine. The AK-47 would go on to become the most widely produced military weapon in human history, with an estimated 100 million or more produced over subsequent decades. Its descendants and variants remain standard infantry weapons in dozens of countries. The United States, despite its initial lead in semi-automatic rifles with the M1 Garand, was actually slower to adopt the assault rifle concept. American ordnance officials remained committed to full-power rifle cartridges and were skeptical of intermediate cartridges throughout the late 1940s and the 1950s. The M14 rifle, which entered service in 1959, was essentially an updated M1 Garand, firing the 7.62 by 51mm NATO cartridge, still a full-power rifle round. It would take the experience of the Vietnam War, where American forces faced enemies armed with AK-47s, and where the limitations of full-power rifle cartridges in jungle combat became painfully apparent, to finally push American ordnance officials toward the assault rifle concept. The M16 rifle, firing the 5.56 by 45mm cartridge, an even lighter intermediate round than the German 7.92 Kurz, entered widespread service in the mid-1960s. It would become the standard American infantry weapon for more than half a century. The M16 and its descendants embodied the same fundamental concepts that the StG 44 had pioneered: an intermediate cartridge optimized for combat at practical engagement ranges, selective fire capability, a detachable high-capacity magazine, and an emphasis on sustained firepower rather than long-range precision. Britain, France, Belgium, Switzerland, and virtually every other nation with significant military forces developed assault rifles in the post-war decades. The specific designs varied, the cartridges varied, the manufacturing, methods and materials varied, but the fundamental concept remained constant: an intermediate cartridge, selective fire, detachable magazine, effective range of 300 to 400 meters, emphasis on controllable rapid fire. These characteristics, pioneered in the StG 44, became the defining features of infantry rifles worldwide. By the end of the 20th century, the bolt-action rifle that had dominated infantry combat for more than 100 years had been completely replaced in first-line military service. Full-power rifle cartridges had been largely abandoned for standard infantry use in favor of intermediate cartridges. The assault rifle had become universal, and every assault rifle in service anywhere in the world owed its conceptual heritage to the StG 44. The engineers and designers who created the StG 44 had fundamentally reshaped infantry combat for generations to come. Hugo Schmeisser, the chief designer of the weapon, survived the war and was taken to the Soviet Union, along with many other German engineers and weapons designers. He worked on Soviet weapons programs for several years before being allowed to return to Germany. Whether his work in the Soviet Union directly influenced the development of the AK-47 remains a matter of historical debate, but there is no question that Soviet designers studied German assault rifle technology intensively. The story of the StG 44 is ultimately a story about innovation under pressure, about the willingness to question fundamental assumptions, and to challenge established doctrine when combat experience revealed the need for change. German engineers and forward-thinking military officers recognized that traditional infantry weapons were poorly optimized for the combat that was actually occurring on the Eastern Front. They had the insight to question whether full-power rifle cartridges were really necessary, the courage to challenge decades of military doctrine, and the engineering skill to create something entirely new. The result was a weapon that arrived too late and in too limited quantities to affect the outcome of the war that spawned it, but that would profoundly influence every war that followed. The American engineers at Aberdeen Proving Ground, who examined the captured StG 44 in spring 1945, understood they were witnessing a paradigm shift in military small arms design. Their detailed technical reports acknowledged both the weapon's revolutionary nature and the uncomfortable reality that German designers had achieved something American ordnance establishment had not even attempted. This recognition sparked intense debates within American military circles about the future direction of infantry weapons development. The discussions were not merely academic exercises in firearms theory. They carried profound implications for how American forces would be equipped in future conflicts, how infantry tactics would evolve, and ultimately how effectively American soldiers could fight and survive on future battlefields. Major General Gladian Barnes, Chief of Research and Development for Army Ordnance, received comprehensive briefings on the StG 44's capabilities and the implications of the assault rifle concept. Barnes was a career ordnance officer with decades of experience in weapons development and procurement. He understood that the German weapon represented more than just an incremental improvement over existing designs. It represented a fundamentally different philosophy of infantry armament. But Barnes and many other senior American ordnance officials faced a difficult dilemma. The United States had just won the largest war in human history, using weapons that had proven effective in combat. The M1 Garand had served superbly, earning praise from soldiers and generals alike. American industry had demonstrated unmatched capacity to produce weapons in enormous quantities. Doctrine, tactics, and training were all built around existing weapons systems. Changing to a completely different type of infantry weapon would require enormous investment in new weapons development, new manufacturing facilities, new ammunition production, new training programs, and new tactical doctrine. It would mean admitting that the weapons that had just won the war were already obsolescent. It would mean scrapping millions of perfectly functional rifles and billions of rounds of ammunition. The institutional resistance to such fundamental change was powerful and understandable. Beyond these practical and institutional concerns, many American ordnance officials genuinely believed that full-power rifle cartridges were superior to intermediate cartridges for military use. They argued that the greater range and power of cartridges like the .30-06 provided capabilities that shouldn't be sacrificed. They believed that reducing cartridge power would reduce the effectiveness of American infantry. They pointed out that American infantry had superior training and marksmanship compared to many potential adversaries, and that full-power rifles allowed trained American shooters to engage enemies at ranges where less powerful weapons would be ineffective. These arguments had merit and reflected genuine expertise and experience. But they also reflected an unwillingness to accept that combat analysis from both German and eventually American experience suggested that most infantry combat occurred at ranges where full-power cartridges offered no practical advantage over intermediate cartridges, while imposing significant disadvantages in recoil, weight, and ammunition capacity. The debate within American military and ordnance circles about assault rifles and intermediate cartridges would continue for nearly 2 decades after the war ended, delaying American adoption of assault rifle technology and ultimately putting American soldiers at a disadvantage in Vietnam, when they faced enemies armed with Soviet-designed assault rifles. But in 1945, as the war in Europe ended and attention turned to the final defeat of Japan and then to demobilization and the emerging Cold War, these debates were just beginning. The StG 44 itself, as a German weapon, became a museum piece and a subject for technical study rather than a weapon that would see further combat use. The German arms industry lay in ruins. Production facilities had been destroyed by bombing or captured by Allied forces. The engineers and designers who had created the weapon were scattered, some dead, some imprisoned, some taken by the Soviets to work on Soviet weapons programs, others trying to rebuild their lives in a devastated Germany. Hugo Schmeisser, whose genius had been instrumental in creating the assault rifle, found himself in Soviet hands, along with many other German weapons designers and engineers. The Soviets, recognizing the enormous value of German military technology and expertise, systematically rounded up German engineers and transported them to the Soviet Union, where they were put to work on Soviet military projects. Schmeisser spent several years in the Soviet Union, working at a weapons design bureau. The exact nature of his work and his influence on Soviet weapons development remains somewhat murky, clouded by Cold War secrecy and by Soviet efforts to minimize foreign contributions to Soviet achievements. Soviet authorities would later claim that the AK-47 was an entirely original Soviet design with no German influence, created solely by the genius of Mikhail Kalashnikov. This claim was part of the broader Soviet pattern of emphasizing Soviet technological independence and minimizing any suggestion that Soviet achievements owed anything to foreign technology or expertise. The truth, as historians and weapons experts have pieced together from fragmentary evidence and post-Cold War revelations, is more nuanced. The AK-47 was indeed designed by Kalashnikov and incorporated his innovations and ideas. But Kalashnikov and other Soviet designers had access to captured StG 44s, had studied the weapon intensively, and clearly borrowed conceptual elements even as they created a mechanically distinct weapon. The 7.62 by 39mm cartridge that the AK-47 was chambered for was clearly inspired by the German 7.92 Kurz, though it was not a direct copy. The overall configuration of the AK-47, with its curved magazine, its selective fire capability, its gas-operated action, and its emphasis on reliability over precision, reflected lessons learned from the StG 44, even as Soviet designers added their own priorities and innovations. Whether Schmeisser personally influenced the AK-47's development remains uncertain. Some historians believe he provided valuable technical consultation. Others believe his role was minimal, and that Soviet designers would have created the AK-47 with or without his presence. What is certain is that the Soviet Union moved quickly to develop and deploy assault rifles in the immediate post-war period, recognizing the value of the concept that the Germans had pioneered. The first AK-47s entered Soviet military service in 1949, just 4 years after the war ended. This rapid development and deployment stood in stark contrast to American and British reluctance to abandon full-power rifle cartridges. The AK-47 would prove to be one of the most successful military weapons in history, not because it was the most accurate or the most refined or the most sophisticated, but because it was reliable, simple, easy to manufacture, easy to maintain, and devastatingly effective in the kinds of combat that characterized the conflicts of the second half of the 20th century. The weapon would be produced in enormous quantities, not just in the Soviet Union, but in China, in Eastern European nations, and eventually in dozens of countries around the world. It would become the standard infantry weapon for the Soviet military and for the militaries of Soviet client states and allies. It would be supplied to revolutionary movements, guerrilla forces, and insurgent groups around the world as part of Soviet efforts to support friendly forces during the Cold War. By the end of the 20th century, AK-47s and their variants and derivatives had been used in virtually every armed conflict on Earth. The weapon became an icon, appearing on the flags of nations, in propaganda imagery, in news photographs from conflict zones worldwide. And every single AK-47 traced its conceptual lineage back to the StG 44 and the revolutionary intermediate cartridge concept that German engineers had pioneered in response to the brutal realities of the East Front. The United States, despite the early warning provided by the captured StG 44s, and despite the detailed technical analysis conducted at Aberdeen Proving Ground, did not move quickly to adopt assault rifle technology. American ordnance officials remained committed to full-power rifle cartridges throughout the late 1940s and the entire decade of the 1950s. When the US developed a new standard infantry rifle to replace the M1 Garand, the weapon they created was the M14, which entered service in 1959. The M14 was a fine rifle in many respects, well-made, accurate, and reliable. But it was essentially an updated M1 Garand, still firing a full-power cartridge, the 7.62 by 51mm NATO round that had been adopted as the standard cartridge for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The M14 could fire on full automatic, unlike the semi-automatic only Garand, but the powerful NATO cartridge made full automatic fire nearly uncontrollable. The weapon climbed severely during automatic fire, making it almost impossible to keep on target beyond the first few rounds. In practical terms, the full automatic capability of the M14 was nearly useless, and soldiers were generally trained to fire it in semi-automatic mode only. The M14 served as the standard American infantry rifle for less than a decade before combat experience in Vietnam revealed its limitations and forced the American military to finally embrace the assault rifle concept that the Germans had pioneered 2 decades earlier. Vietnam, with its jungles, its close-range combat, its emphasis on rapid firepower over long-range precision, was exactly the kind of environment where assault rifles excelled and where full-power rifles struggled. American soldiers in Vietnam found themselves facing enemies armed with AK-47s and SKS carbines, both Soviet-designed weapons using intermediate cartridges. In the close-range firefights that characterized much of the combat in Vietnam, the AK-47's controllable automatic fire and 30-round magazine gave enemy soldiers advantages that the M14 couldn't match. The M14 was heavier than the AK-47, held only 20 rounds compared to 30, and its full automatic fire was uncontrollable. American soldiers were being outgunned by enemies equipped with weapons based on a German design from World War II. The solution came in the form of the M16 rifle, which had been developed by Eugene Stoner and was initially adopted in limited quantities by the Air Force and by some special operations units, before being pushed into wider service in Vietnam. The M16 was controversial when it first entered service, facing reliability problems that were partly due to design issues, but more significantly due to inadequate cleaning and maintenance in the harsh conditions of jungle warfare, and to ammunition problems that were not the rifle's fault. But once these issues were addressed, through improved training, better maintenance, and corrected ammunition, the M16 proved to be exactly what American infantry needed for Vietnam. The M16 fired the 5.56 by 45mm cartridge, an even lighter intermediate round than the German 7.92 Kurz or the Soviet 7.62 by 39. The lighter cartridge meant soldiers could carry more ammunition for the same weight, a critical advantage in the sustained firefights that often occurred in Vietnam. The M16 was lighter than the M14, making it less fatiguing to carry during long patrols through difficult terrain. Its automatic fire was controllable, allowing soldiers to deliver suppressive fire effectively. Its 30-round magazine provided the sustained fire capability needed in close-range combat. The M16 and its descendants, including the M4 carbine variant that has become the standard American infantry weapon in the 21st century, embodied all the key concepts of the assault rifle that the StG 44 had pioneered. Intermediate cartridge, selective fire, detachable high-capacity magazine, emphasis on effectiveness at practical combat ranges rather than maximum theoretical range. The American military had finally accepted what German combat experience on the Eastern Front had revealed 2 decades earlier, that infantry combat mostly occurs at intermediate ranges, and that weapons should be optimized for the combat that actually occurs, rather than the combat that doctrine imagines might occur. British forces followed a similar path, initially resisting the assault rifle concept before eventually adopting it. The British developed the EM2 rifle in the late 1940s, an innovative bullpup design firing an intermediate cartridge. But political pressure from the United States, which wanted NATO standardization around the 7.62 by 51mm cartridge, forced Britain to abandon the EM2 and adopt the Belgian-designed FN FAL rifle firing the full-power NATO cartridge. The FAL was an excellent rifle, reliable and effective, but it fired a full-power cartridge and suffered from the same limitations in automatic fire that plagued the M14. Eventually, Britain too would move to an intermediate cartridge assault rifle, adopting the 5.56mm SA-80 in the 1980s. By the end of the 20th century, virtually every modern military force on Earth had adopted assault rifles as their standard infantry weapons. The specific designs varied enormously, reflecting different national priorities, different tactical doctrines, different manufacturing capabilities, and different historical paths. But the fundamental concept remained consistent across all of them. An intermediate cartridge optimized for practical combat ranges, selective fire capability, a detachable magazine holding 20 to 30 rounds, and an effective range of roughly 300 meters with acceptable performance out to 400 or even 500 meters. These characteristics, pioneered in the StG 44 in response to combat experience on the Eastern Front, had become universal. The bolt-action rifles that had dominated infantry combat since the late 19th century had been completely replaced in first-line military service. Full-power rifle cartridges had been largely relegated to specialized roles like designated marksman rifles and sniper weapons rather than standard infantry use. The submachine gun, once a crucial infantry weapon, had been largely relegated to specialized roles in law enforcement and special operations, where its compact size was more important than range or power. The assault rifle had proven to be the optimal general-purpose infantry weapon for modern warfare, effective enough at all ranges from close quarters to several hundred meters that it could replace both submachine guns and rifles in most situations. The dominance of the assault rifle concept represented vindication of the insights that German engineers and officers had arrived at through painful combat experience on the Eastern Front. Their willingness to question fundamental assumptions about what an infantry weapon should be, their courage in challenging established doctrine, and their engineering skill in creating something entirely new had reshaped infantry combat for generations. The StG-44 itself, the weapon that started it all, remains a significant artifact in the history of military technology. Examples of the weapon are prized by museums and collectors. Firing an original StG-44, when ammunition can be found or manufactured, provides a tangible connection to the revolutionary moment when infantry weapons took a decisive turn in a new direction. The weapon feels surprisingly modern for something designed 8 decades ago. The controls are logically placed, the sights are adequate, the overall ergonomics are reasonable if not outstanding. In semi-automatic mode, the weapon is controllable and reasonably accurate at combat ranges. In full automatic mode, the 7.92 Kurz cartridge generates enough recoil that sustained fire causes the weapon to climb, but short controlled bursts are quite manageable. The 30-round magazine, which seemed revolutionary in the 1940s, is now standard for military rifles worldwide. The selective fire capability, once innovative, is now universal. The intermediate cartridge concept, once controversial and dismissed by many experts, is now accepted as obviously correct. What was revolutionary in 1944 has become conventional wisdom, so thoroughly absorbed into military thinking that most people today would find it difficult to understand why it was ever controversial. The story of the StG-44 reminds us that innovation often requires challenging established wisdom and questioning assumptions that everyone accepts as true. The assumption that infantry rifles needed to fire full-power cartridges had been accepted for more than half a century when German engineers began questioning it. The assumption was supported by respected experts, by military doctrine, by decades of experience, and by the entire infrastructure of military training and logistics. Challenging that assumption required both intellectual courage and empirical evidence from combat that the assumption was wrong. The German engineers who created the intermediate cartridge and the assault rifle to use it were not rejecting expertise or dismissing the value of established knowledge. They were synthesizing combat experience, technical analysis, and innovative thinking to arrive at a better solution to a real problem. They were willing to let evidence change their minds, even when that evidence contradicted established doctrine. The fact that Adolf Hitler initially rejected the assault rifle program, that development had to continue in secret in defiance of his orders, that the weapon only received official approval when Germany's desperate military situation made innovation impossible to ignore, demonstrates how resistant institutions can be to revolutionary change, even when that change is clearly beneficial. The officers and engineers who continued the program in secret were taking enormous personal risks in Nazi Germany, where defying Hitler's orders could have catastrophic consequences. Their willingness to take those risks because they believed so strongly in the weapon's value speaks to their courage and their commitment to providing German soldiers with the best possible equipment. The impact of the StG-44 extends far beyond its direct influence on subsequent assault rifle designs. The weapon demonstrated that careful analysis of actual combat conditions could reveal opportunities for innovation that weren't apparent from theory or peacetime training alone. It demonstrated that sometimes the solution to a problem requires changing the fundamental parameters rather than optimizing within existing constraints. It demonstrated that weapons should be designed for the combat that actually occurs rather than the combat that doctrine expects to occur. These lessons have applications far beyond small arms design. They apply to military technology development generally, to tactics and doctrine, to organizational design, to any field where established practices might not be optimal for actual conditions. The story of the StG-44 is ultimately a story about the power of evidence-based innovation, about the courage required to challenge conventional wisdom, and about how warfare drives technological change. Combat is the ultimate test of military technology and doctrine. What works in theory or in peacetime exercises might fail catastrophically in actual combat. What seems impossible or impractical might prove to be the key to victory when tested under fire. The German engineers who created the assault rifle were responding to real combat problems reported by real soldiers, fighting real battles. They let combat experience drive their design choices, rather than letting preconceptions or established doctrine constrain their thinking. The result was a weapon that worked superbly in the conditions it was designed for, and that pointed the way forward for all subsequent infantry weapons development. Today, more than 8 decades after Hugo Schmeisser and his team at Heinel created the first assault rifle, soldiers around the world carry weapons that embody the concepts that revolutionary German design pioneered. The AK-47 and its variants, the M16 and M4, the German G36, the British SA-80, the French FAMAS, the Austrian ARG, the Israeli Tavor, and dozens of other assault rifles in service with militaries worldwide all trace their conceptual heritage back to that first StG 44. Every one of these weapons represents refinement and evolution of the fundamental insight that German combat experience on the Eastern Front revealed. That infantry combat mostly happens at intermediate ranges, and that weapons should be optimized for those ranges. The revolution in infantry weapons that began with the StG 44 continues today as modern assault rifles incorporate new materials, new manufacturing methods, electronic sights and accessories, improved ergonomics, and countless other refinements. But the fundamental concept remains the same as it was in 1944. The assault rifle that German engineers pioneered in response to the brutal realities of the Eastern Front proved to be not just an effective weapon for World War II, but the template for infantry weapons for the rest of the 20th century and into the 21st. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.